So Joshua, into the land is the subtitle of this. Now, Joshua, really important book in the Bible because Joshua is, we've moved out of the Pentateuch and now we're into what are called in your English order the historical books. And Joshua is going to pick us up with where Deuteronomy left us off. Remember Deuteronomy, Moses dies outside the promised land, he can't enter. But he kind of hands the baton to Joshua and says, take them in. Okay, so what does this look like? So what I want to do with Joshua is the same thing I did with Deuteronomy. I want to start giving you themes for the book and then just talk about a couple of key events. All right? So let's start by talking about the key themes, the major themes of Joshua. The first major theme of Joshua is Yahweh's gift of the land to Israel. Yahweh's gift of the land to Israel. You're going to notice a lot more pictures in this PowerPoint. I guess I should label these. I didn't. But this is a picture of what are called the hills of Naphtali, right at a place called Tel Hatzor, which I have another picture later in here with that. So the reason I'm showing you these pictures is because oftentimes when we think of the land, we think of what? Well, it was kind of represented in that first slide. Desert. You think of wilderness. But what's interesting is because when we think of desert wilderness, then we read the Bible. How does the Bible oftentimes describe this land? A land flowing with milk and honey, which is kind of a metaphor for bounty. Okay? So what's interesting is when we think of the land as desert, that's usually like Jerusalem and south. Because there's Jerusalem and then you get the Judean wilderness and all that area down there by the Dead Sea. Okay? But really north of there, you do get luscious land. I mean, it's abundant farmland, really, especially up in Galilee, which is where this was taken. This was up in Galilee, just off of a city called Hatzor. It was an ancient city. It's no longer a city. It's an archaeological dig now. So here's the deal. Yahweh is giving Israel this land, okay? And what's interesting is that the Canaanites are already in this land, and I want to read a passage. It kind of gives us a representation of what's happening here. So Joshua 2:9-11 says this. This is, by the way, Rahab talking. She says to them, I know that Yahweh your God has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For Yahweh your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. So here's a point I want to make about this. What's interesting about the inhabitants of the land is that they had already heard of Israel's reputation. Did y'all hear that? In fact, Rahab, when the spies come to Jericho, mentions that they had heard what they did to the two kings of the Amorites, and how God had led them through the Red Sea. So do you remember this connects us back to Exodus, where God was trying to demonstrate that He's the one true God. So what does this mean? This means that basically Rahab says to them, the inhabitants of the land were really scared before you. We're intimidated. Okay? Now this reminds me, have you ever seen the movie Little Giants? Anybody? Okay, a few of you. It's like this, it's like what happens is this elementary school has a football team. Not a school, but like an elementary football league. And all the good players get on the A team. And so all the nerds are left on the team by themselves. And one of the nerd dads just decides he wants to play football. So he coaches his team. And so basically they just kind of outwit the studs, so to speak, and they beat them. And it's called Little Giants. Anyway, but there's one scene in there where in order to intimidate the other team, they put, Alka-Seltzer in their mouth. And so they walk up to the line and they're foaming at the mouth. And so it's silly, but then the other team just runs in fear because they think they're foaming at the mouth. And so here's the deal. That in that movie, you get people who really could do nothing, pretending they could do something and scaring the other person. In the book of Joshua, what we see is that you get a God who can do something, terrifying the inhabitants. In other words, they're literally shaking in their boots even before Israel starts any battle. They're already terrified because they've heard of God's reputation. Okay? So God goes before them into the land to prepare by putting fear in their hearts. But then when they get in the land, here's the interesting thing. He actually fights for Israel. So Yahweh's gift of the land, part of that is he actually fights for Israel. And so here's what I mean. As you read Joshua, you might have noticed that there were a couple of what we might call a miraculous victory. Now, the most famous, the world famous miraculous victory is the Battle of Jericho, right? You guys have all seen the VeggieTales version of that, right? So Jericho is miraculous, and we usually think of it being miraculous because they march around the wall 7 days, and seventh day they march 7 times, and the wall falls. Now, if you put that in the ancient cultural perspective, that's pretty impressive because usually when a city was attacked, whoever was attacking the city would employ siege warfare, which you'll hear this more because this happens to Israel by the Babylonians and the Assyrians. But they would surround the wall, they would surround the city, cut off supply lines, and basically build these giant earthen mounds to get up to the wall because most cities were built on hills. So they would build the earthen wall, and then they would take these big battering carts, basically these rams, and just hit the wall. If you've seen any like medieval war movie like Braveheart, you know what I'm talking about. And they just batter the walls until they can breach the walls. Well, sometimes that can take multiple years, like 2 to 3 years. And you just get one breach, right? Like when the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem, it took them 2 years and they got a breach finally. So 7 days and all the walls come down is extremely miraculous, which is why it shows that God was actually fighting for them. Now, there's another story that's another miraculous victory that illustrates God's fighting for Israel. And this was when there was basically this army, there's 5 kings that made a coalition to attack Israel, okay, as Joshua was coming up through the land. And Joshua was fighting with them, and 2 things happened that are actually miraculous. One is, many of you have heard of this. This is where Joshua is fighting a battle, and he needs a little more daylight. So he prays and asks God to do what? Make the sun stand still, okay? So the sun stops. Well, actually, we know the sun didn't stop, the earth stopped. But anyway, the sun stands still, and Joshua defeats those kings. Well, the other part that we're not familiar with is there was a part of that story where those kings are fleeing before Joshua, and God sent giant hailstones down on their armies. And it literally says in Joshua 10 that more of the enemy armies died from hailstones than they did with the sword. Okay? So what does that mean? It shows that Israel has the divine warrior, which is a common portrayal of God in the Old Testament, on their side. And he is literally fighting their battles with them and for them, which is why we call it the gift of the land. Israel is given the land by God in that regard. Okay? Now, the second thing that's interesting about Yahweh's gift of the land is after they conquer, you guys might notice in your reading of Joshua, I'll let you skip from chapter 12 really to chapter 23. And if anybody skimmed that section, you were probably saying thank you for your professor, because what that section is, chapters 13 through 22, is the division of the land. So what happens is the book of Joshua, after they get the land, it then spends these chapters describing the tribal allotment for each tribe of Israel. So it'd be kind of like if you walked around your hometown and were describing like everybody's property lines. Okay, that's kind of a good illustration of it. Like, you know, old Jim over there has that fence post, from that fence line over to that tree, over to that stone, over to that road. I mean, that's the kind of the idea, okay, except they would just name cities that were the boundaries. So it's not the most thrilling reading. So let's just summarize it really easily. I'll show you a map, and you can't really see the map. Can y'all see the map? I don't know why the maps are so faded on this. This map's in the ESV Study Bible if you have it. But what I want to show you is you can see, so there's like Manasseh. So this is the Jordan River here. You got Manasseh over here. You've got Manasseh here. There's Ephraim, Benjamin, Judah. You can hopefully see them now. But what's interesting about this map, and this is important to know, is there was one tribe of Israel who actually didn't get a land inheritance, and that was whom? The Levites, right? The Levites were responsible for working at the tabernacle and then later the temple. And God did not give them a land inheritance. They were actually dispersed among the tribes. Or they actually had cities among the tribes, sorry. The other interesting, so that drops us, so we have 12 tribes. One doesn't get an allotment. That drops us to how many? 11. Good. I got some math people in here. Okay. But if you were to count this, there's still 12. What gives? Do y'all remember? Okay, good. I'm glad you brought that up. So even though this Manasseh gets two sides, they're still counted as one tribe. So we still have so where do we get our 12th from? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with Joseph. Okay, good. So you see right here, Ephraim and Manasseh, those are Joseph's two. So you notice Joseph's name's not up here, but he was one of the 12. So what happened is Joseph got the right of the firstborn, so he gets a double inheritance. So his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, get a lot. So that brings us back up to 12. So that's how that works, okay? So just keep that in mind. That's why you don't hear of the land of Joseph. You hear the land of Ephraim and the land of Manasseh, okay? Now, any questions on that? Okay. The next thing that's important, so that's the first major theme. Yahweh gives Israel the land. The second major theme in Joshua is the necessity of obedience. Now, there's a lot we could say here. If you remember from your reading, the first chapter of Joshua, God emphasizes to Joshua the importance of meditating on the book of Moses, on the law, day and night, not to go astray to the right or the left. And he says, if you do, you will be what in all that you do? He uses the word successful. And what that means is, here's the deal. God did not give Israel a blank check and say, hey, all you got to do is go to the land and I'm going to give it to you. In fact, what he tells Joshua is that their success in military fighting is connected to their obedience to the Torah, to the law of Moses, to the Sinai covenant. So that's reiterated at the first. At the end of the book, you might remember when Joshua's about to die, you guys read this, he tells the people, he urges them, that if they want to stay in the land and they want to prosper, they have to obey. So the book is bookended by exhortations for obedience. They have to obey, okay? But what's interesting is there's one little story in the middle of the book, in the center of the book, where the necessity of obedience is actually illustrated for us, okay? And that is the story of Rahab versus Achan. Rahab versus Achan. Now this story, it's not one story, it's two stories. Now, this contrast was, there's a book called Grasping God's Word by Danny Hayes and Duval is his last name, I'm forgetting his first name, but they use this as an example of contrast in narrative. And so think about it with me. You guys read it. Rahab, I just read Rahab's word. Who is Rahab? Okay, good. She's first of all known as a prostitute, so she's not the most upstanding lady. But what else is important about Rahab? Prostitute is not the greatest strike against Rahab. What's the greatest strike against Rahab? Not just any Gentile, she's a Canaanite. Remember, what did we just talk about in Deuteronomy? The ban. Thank you, the ban. Okay, so we talked about the ban against the Canaanites, okay? So Ruth is a Canaanite. And if you remember in chapter 2, before they even cross the Jordan, the spies go over and she houses the Israelite spies and even hides them on the roof and tells the guards who come looking for them, I don't know where they went, maybe that way. She got them out of there. So you get Rahab. And what does Rahab get as a result of that? She's saved, right? So I like to think of it this way. If you think about the walls falling, you remember her house was in the wall, which was common in the ancient world. They would build their houses, the back wall of their house would be the city wall. And remember, she put the scarlet thread out. And I like to picture the city of Jericho, the walls just collapsing, and then there's this one little house standing, and it's like Rahab and her family, right? So here's the deal. Because Rahab was not... So, by the way, what motivated Rahab to help the spies? Was it just like she's a nice person? There it is. Yeah, did y'all hear that quote I read? The quote that I read earlier, here's what she tells the spies. For Yahweh your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. What's she saying? That's right. Yahweh's the one true God, right? Remember, in the ancient world, and especially in ancient Near East with the pagans, they had every kind of aspect of nature was a personification of a god. So you had your sun god, you had your storm god, you had all these gods that represent different aspects. And what Rahab says is, your God, He's the God of the heaven and the earth, which means He covers it all. So Rahab, here's the deal, is motivated by faith and fear of Israel's God. So she helps them. And as a result of that, what happens? She and her family are spared. Everybody got that? Now, let's talk about Achan. A little later in the story, what happens with Achan? Who is Achan? What is he? What's his nationality? He's an Israelite. What does he do? He takes some of what are called the devoted items, which means, in other words, with the band, they weren't even supposed to take like money or any, like that was one of the great things in the ancient world being a soldier, is when you conquered your enemies, you got to take their stuff. But Israel was commanded not to do that with the Canaanites. They were to just destroy it all. And he took some of it, right? And when they find out who it is, what happens? Him and his whole entire family are stoned to death. Okay, so here's the contrast Duval and Hayes say. This is really important. Rahab should have died, but because of her faith and obedience, her and her family were spared. Achan should have lived and prospered, but because of his disobedience, he and his family died. Okay? So that's the contrast. So what this is showing us is how seriously and how important obedience to Yahweh is in this story in the book of Joshua. Now, let me say one other thing about Rahab. This is where, to connect it back to the problem of what skeptics will say is Canaanite genocide, is I think Rahab is a perfect example of why that's not the case. Rahab, have you ever heard the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law? Right? Some of you play that out really well, the mask, right? You focus on the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. You know what I'm saying? Some of you don't know what I'm saying, but it's okay. I got to be careful on that one. All right, so here we go. So letter of the law is like, we would say, like obeying it to a T, right? Like you do it, like you're like on it. You always have your nose covered and you're on it, right? Spirit of the law is recognizing, okay, the spirit of the law is I wear a mask in order not to spread it. So if I'm 6 feet from somebody, I'm not even going to worry about it, right? That's kind of the spirit of the law. Okay, so here's the deal. This shows us, Rahab shows us the spirit of the law behind the ban. And remember we said the first reason God gives as to why they are to destroy the Canaanites is because he was what? Judging them for their wickedness, right? So here's the deal. If the spirit of the law isn't racism, in other words, God's not racist against Canaanites, instead the spirit of the law is he's judging the Canaanites for their national rebellion and wickedness. When Rahab repents and turns to him, she's spared. Because that's the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law isn't you should die just because you're a Canaanite. The spirit of the law is you're being judged, right? I'm glad you, thanks for bringing that up because that's perfect. Listen, did you hear that? So this is showing, again, please hear this. Oftentimes, when skeptics come at this, they come at it like God's racist, he hates Canaanites, he's genocide. But here we've got a Canaanite woman. Not just any woman, by the way. She's a shady lady. I mean, she's a prostitute. So we get a Canaanite prostitute who is willing to turn to Yahweh. He not only spares her, he spares her whole family. And then she becomes, if you go to Matthew 1, she becomes a part of the line of the Messiah. So it's not like he just let her come into his people and stay on the fringe. God brought this woman in so deep into his people that the very Savior of his people to come, she's an ancestor of. That screams grace and mercy, right? And it screams here again, the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. The spirit of the law for the ban was judgment for sin. Rahab repents, puts her faith, and she's Exhibit A. This is Exhibit A of why that's not genocide. And it can't be genocide. There's other exhibits as we go too, we'll talk about. Okay? The letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. So this I would say this kind of that distinction is what kind of stands behind a lot of Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees too. The Pharisees were really good at keeping the letter of the law. Like the law says this, I'm going to do it, like just like this. And Jesus kind of pushed them on something, and they would do that with the tradition. They would add traditions too. So yeah. So again, that's kind of a helpful distinction that helps us approach it on that. So. And the mass work is a good illustration because you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. All right, here we go. Huh? That's right. All right, here we go. Any other questions on that? All right, last theme. Here's the last theme that we have in the book. The last theme is Yahweh's faithfulness to his promises. Okay. Joshua, let me read a passage for you. I'm going to read Joshua chapter 21. Verses 43 through 45. I'll get there really quick. I want you to listen as I read this to what is repeated several times. Okay, here we go. This is Joshua's... this is not Joshua. This is the author of the book. He says, "Thus Yahweh gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, And they took possession of it, and they settled there. And Yahweh gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for Yahweh had given them all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that Yahweh had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. What's emphasized repeatedly in that passage? Yes, he gave them the land just as he promised, just as he swore, just as he promised, like 3 times in there. Okay? And the fathers there again, remember the fathers are referring to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this is connecting Joshua to which covenant? Abrahamic covenant. It's showing, so what the end of Joshua is saying is God kept his promise. He told you he was going to give you the land of Canaan. Boom, you've got the land of Canaan. So it's saying, like, check, God kept his promises to you guys, and Yahweh is faithful to those promises. Now, here's how I'm going to kind of drive home at the end of class. This is important because when we think about Yahweh's faithfulness, God's faithfulness, this still applies today because we would say that God's character and ways do not change. God's character and person do not change. So just as he was faithful to the Israelites to complete what he's promised, so he's faithful to us to complete what we promised. Now here's the deal. All of us, I would ask for a show of hands, but it's kind of a moot point because all of us have made commitments to people and not been able to keep them. And it's not always malicious. You hear me? So some people like make commitments knowing they're not going to keep them just because they don't have the courage enough to say no. Okay? Other people make commitments. Many times, if you're genuine, you've made a commitment, and then what happens? Why can't you keep it? Okay, somebody said life. Yeah. Okay, unforeseen circumstances. Would that be a good way to describe life? Unforeseen circumstances. So we make a commitment to someone or a promise, and then something happens that we didn't see coming, and so we can't keep the promise. Okay, here's the deal. When it comes to God, that's the cool thing about God because he not only knows the future exhaustively, so he doesn't get caught off guard by unforeseen circumstances, but this is the cool thing. He can actually has the power to orchestrate events to accomplish what he desires. So as believers, when God makes a promise that applies to us, and I'm going to come back to that, we can trust and take it to the bank that he is going to fulfill what he promised because he is both omniscient, he knows all things, and he's omnipotent. He can do all things. Okay? And because of that, we can rely on him more so, or abundantly, infinitely more than we can ever rely on each other, another human being, because God doesn't have unforeseen circumstances. Now, what gets a lot of Christians in trouble, though, is this promise part. We have to be very careful that as Christians, that we're not claiming someone else's promises. Does that make sense? So that doesn't mean that we open our Bibles and if there's a promise given that it applies to us. We have to read the context and make sure that it's a promise that applies to us as believers. Does that make sense? So not every promise in the Bible is given to you and I. That's where good biblical interpretation comes in. But if there is a promise that God meant to give for all believers, then you can take it to the bank that God is going to fulfill that promise. Now here's the deal. Remember Abraham, like 25 years waiting on the promise? It might not be instant like we like things, like we want them instantly. God oftentimes makes us wait on his promises. Why does he do that? Okay, yes, character, but in particular faith. It increases our faith because it forces us to wait patiently, something that we're not used to doing. And as we wait patiently, it does build character, but it's really important to think that depth of faith is what it's building too, that we are forced to truly, what do you call it, put to the test what we believe. Do we really believe that God is faithful? And do we really believe that God is there? Is the other kicker there. Okay?